Okay, I think. So good morning to everybody. This is a shared presentation, so I will start myself setting the scene, telling you or something about eIDAS and why eIDAS as a regulation is relevant to the work that is happening in the context of distributed ledgers, blockchain. Oh, excellent. And in addition to this, the way in which I would say the services which are associated to the legal framework, which is indeed what eIDAS convey, are why the technical implementation is also extremely important in relation to what is the use of, I would say, authoritative credentials which may be associated to identities which are proved up to the highest standard that you can think. So the first part will be myself, then there will be something from Carlos on the implementation of eIDAS, so how we are rolling out the interoperability infrastructure that supports the recognition of electronic identification for services across the 28 member states. And the last part is how the legal framework is relevant to what is indeed transacted in blockchain. So first of all, what is eIDAS? Is a regulation, is about cross-border, is about trust, is about convenience, is about seamless transactions which could indeed be made trustworthy in relation to both what is the level of security that is associated to the transactions, but even more importantly, what is the enforceability, the recognition, the legal proofs that the transaction may carry as associated to either identity or trust services, which could be the electronic signature, so anything that is equivalent to the white signature that you use every day, e-seals, which carries the proof of origin and integrity of something that is exchanged in the digital, or timestamping that gives the proofs, which is enforceable in law, on the date of conclusion of certain transactions and the integrity of what is associated with the transaction. Electronic registered delivery services, which is to some extent the equivalent to what you have on the physical world of as a registered surface mail, which in the digital means that it will carry legal proof, and depends on the nature of the service, associated to the identification of the sender, identification of the recipient, integrity of the exchange, confidentiality of the exchange, time of delivery, time of receipt. And that is what I think is indeed, I would say, a good way, for instance, of serving the purpose contractually to ensure that what you send is actually what is received. When is sent is proved to be sent, when you claim to be sent, and even more importantly, disregarding whether somebody is opening or not opening what they receive. When indeed the, I would say, registered delivery has happened, so when the recipient is receiving the document. All these should be seamless, because there is no point to do things in a way that is constrained by the digital environment. This is why the eIDAS regulation brought forward, and it was endorsed by the Council and the Parliament, so it means by the Member States that mobile environment is the target, I would say, environment where this type of services should be put to work, and where indeed the convenience is more, I would say, easily, reached in relation to convert to this transaction. And it is cross-border. So it means it's enforceable in all the 28 member states. It's a regulation, so there is no transposition. It applies as such from Rome to Stockholm, from Porto to Sofia. What is indeed that eIDAS covers? As I said, electronic identification means disregarding the way in which electronic identification is managed or is somehow supported in terms of means at the national level. It could be an electronic identity card, it could be a mobile card, it could be a citizen credentials, could be a health card, it could be a fiscal card, doesn't matter. What I think has been demonstrated with the, I would say, projects that the Commission and the pilots that the Commission had launched back in 2008 until 2015, is that disregarding what is the type of means that you have in your hand, you can, on the digital, make electronic identification credential to be recognized for the purpose of online engagement. Of course, when it comes to physical, I would say, use of these different means, that is difficult. But when we talk about online engagement, which means using electronic identification means to access services cross-border provided by public sectors, for which either by law or administrative procedure, the use of electronic identification means is requested at the national level, then citizens in Europe should be free to use electronic identification means they are already using in their countries for the purpose of accessing services in other countries to which, of course, they are entitled. The second part, as I said, is on trust services, but there is a third part which normally is ignored, but you have to bear this in mind. It's the first time that at the European level there is legislation on electronic document. As an engineer, I thought that electronic document wouldn't be recognized cross-border by construction, but actually it's not. It's because of eIDAS that we have the first ever non-discriminatory principles and rules which are introduced in European legislation, which means an electronic document cannot be rejected in court for the simple reason that it is in electronic form, which seems to be very obvious, but actually it's not. We needed an specific article in the regulation. Few things on how identity is managed. Sovereignty of member states. Why? Because this is about recognition by public administration across member states. Just to give you the analogy, it's like for passport. Passport is not introduced for the purpose of making private sector to recognize identification document. Is introduced for countries to be able to associate the entitlement to be in a country to persons who are in the country. But then those means are also leveraged by private sector. If you open a bank account, you may use your passport or an electronic identity card, simply for the reason that being those means recognized by countries, then of course, the private sector in this case, banks do leverage this recognition for the purpose of discharging their responsibility to identify at best who is the prospective client. Of course, passport is not sufficient because you need something else, but that goes into the process of verifying that the person is indeed the legitimate owner of this type of entitlement. And more important, sovereignty of member states, full autonomy of the private sector. They may use it or not use it, their problem. What I think is important to highlight is that the member states, while acknowledging the importance to retain the control of what they can the way in which they may regulate the use of electronic identity at the national level, because indeed it is part of the sovereign responsibility they have towards citizens, they do also, I would say, encourage, and they are required to encourage private sector to participate in the development of the ecosystem, which means both in the provisioning of electronic identification means. If you look at what has been notified so far, you see that private sector schemes have already been notified, but also in using what indeed the schemes are bringing forward, which means trusted assertion about the identity, which may convey the legal proof up to in-person verification, as it is acknowledged, for instance, recognized in the Anti-Money Laundering Directive, recently, number 5, which was recently adopted. In terms of where we stand, of course, national responsibility is, national sovereignty is good, but there is also a side effect, which means the member states are not required under the regulation to notify. Why? Because the legal basis is internal market. We don't have legal basis at the European level to rule the way in which the identity and electronic identity should be harmonized, may be harmonized. We may look at how means may be recognized. It is the case, for instance, for identity card. We define the template and know what is the process that associates an identity to a person. But what is interesting is that as of the 29th of September of this year, member states, disregarding whether they have notified or not, they are indeed obliged to recognize at the national level the notified electronic identification means for the purpose of allowing access to their public services, should indeed the provision of these services be based on the use of nationally recognized electronic identification means of the same assurance level or lower. Why? Because we are not putting the focus here on what is the means that is recognized. Well, if you are in Germany, for instance, now the federal government is requiring the use of electronic identity. But in my case, I'm Italian. I can use the SPID, the private sector credentials, which have been notified by Italy and can be used in a near time, because the notification is just concluded, to access those services in Germany, which will require a German citizen, for which a German citizen will be required to use an electronic identity card. Different means, different beast, different jurisdiction, different primary purpose, but the same functionality. And that, I think, is important, because it shows that what matters when you do identification online is indeed the trustworthiness of the credentials which are associated to the means that you're using, is not the nature of the means in itself. So if I use a citizen card in Austria to access governmental services, should Austria notify such means, I would be able, as an Austrian, to use those to access services in Sweden, but I will not be able to use that citizen card in the airport, because it's not a travel document. I think that is important, because all these experience and all this framework brings the focus on the means to be transacted and recognized. And of course, here you have also a variety in terms of means. You have card, ID card, you have mobile identity, you have diplomat's identity, Estonia notified the diplomat's identity, but also you have a e-residency, which is the identity means which are given to non-Europeans in order to benefit from services in Estonia. How we got here? We didn't start yesterday, nor in 2012. Actually, we started back in 2004, first discussion, and the focus was how can we ensure the citizen will be able to access governmental services by using those credentials that they may be already using at the national level, to access similar services which indeed require such type of authentication. The first conversation started in 2004, and it was clear at that moment in time there were in Europe more or less at the different level, regional, national, city level, hundreds more different type of means being used. What indeed the member states in their wisdom, supported by the Commission, I must say, decided was, okay, let's do first a project, a pilot, to show whether we can have interoperability between different beasts, different means, because at the end of the day, the engagement is online. So what you transact are the data. What is indeed important is to make sure that in a way we can reach interoperability and a trust framework which will allow to map different type of means one to another. And this is what started in 2008 and has concluded more or less in 2015, 2016. We had the stock 1, stock 2, eSense, and in 2012 we put the regulation forward. Why? Because the technology is never the problem. I'm an engineer. Technology may be the problem, but it's never the problem. What the problem is the legal framework. Who is liable for what? How I can prove the assurance? How I can indeed make sure that what is enforceable in my country will be enforceable in another country? And the recipient country would indeed be reassured that indeed what they rely upon without really seeing the person could indeed hold in court as indeed their own national means. And of course, we are here at the time of rolling up, but what is indeed ahead of us is the ecosystem, because at the end of the day, as it is for identity is just a trust anchor. But what I think is important, and what we believe is important, is the way in which we can move from the identity to the provision of assertions, trusted proofs, trusted attestation, credentials, attributes, which will make it possible for the identity to speak for us and not to speak about us. If I need to access or to buy alcohol, they don't need my name. They need to have my age. Not even my age. They need to know that I'm more than a certain age. So if I get online trusted proofs like a yes with a stamp or whatever that is enforceable, so that if there is a problem, somebody, not necessarily the service provider, but an authority or whoever, could indeed link that yes to me, then of course, whoever is receiving that assertion is discharged the responsibility to collect all the data to prove whether I'm more than 18 or not. And this is why our interest in rolling out the eIDAS has been so far to push for completing the legal framework and putting the member states into the mood of moving forward with their notification, because that is important. But of course, why should they notify? eventually, I think even in the most digital countries, you do 3-4 transactions per year with member state, with government. The value here is everything else that is not government, that is not governmental. And there is where indeed, to push this, you will see, we have made quite a bit of work in making the digital to kick in sector-specific legislation, starting with the Anti-Money Laundering Directive. Because if you get it there, which worked is a framework to fight financing of terrorism, fighting financing of organized crime, then it works everywhere. And this is why, we are working, and we are now, the wave is how we can use eID as the trust anchor to make the provisioning of trusted attributes, trusted credentials, entitlements to work in the digital. Because at the end of the day, we need to make user, and here, let's be clear, eIDAS is about natural person, legal person. First region in the world that has a policy, a regulation, which define the liabilities, by the way, technological infrastructures, and enforcement mechanism to make the recognition of sovereign identity to be enforceable, to be recognized across the different jurisdictions. And because of this, identity is indeed to be used as the trust anchor. If I need if I want to do a transaction, I should be able to disclose only those proofs that are making me eligible for the transaction. What might be needed is to have the proofs associated to an identity, but very often the identity is not even needed. This is why, for instance, in Article 5.2 of the regulation, we acknowledge the possibility, in a way that may be perceived as a bit crazy, that in a framework to build trust between member states, the use of pseudonym at the national level is not impeded. Why? Because the use of pseudonyms which are validated is actually protection for the citizen, which can use the power of having been identified for the provisioning of services to which he or her is entitled, in a way that indeed the proof is linked to an identity which by itself is not disclosed. And this is where we are indeed working, and of course this is becoming extremely important when we look at new areas: payment, financial transaction, opening bank account. One solid principle, single digital gateway regulation will allow its citizen to be able, myself I'm Italian, I live in Brussels, so in Belgium, if I have procedure to be completed with the public administration in Belgium and I have to provide data which are already available in my own country, where I was born or I have lived before, and these data are available in the digital way, I may provide a consent to the public administration in Belgium to fetch the data, the digital data, where such data are. Of course, this cross-border can only be assured if there is the same type of legal framework in relation to enforcement of the authentication and identification credential, so that the Belgian authority knows that it's the right Andrea Servida which is speaking, but it's the right Andrea Servida which is giving the consent for the data which are associated to him in another country, and the recipient of the request should have the same legal proof that he is the right Andrea Servida which has given a consent for the data to be transacted. This can be very simple, but actually when you have jurisdictions, member states that have quite an important resilient element to defend, they have legal, I would say, exposure, liabilities to manage is quite something. And of course, this doesn't only build on identity. For the one solid principle in the single digital gateway regulation, we have to leverage the identification, which is the first step, but the consent. How do you do the consent? Electronic signature. Because the electronic signature, although may not speak for you, it speaks about the consent of whoever is indeed, I would say, the owner of that signature. Electronic seals, because we need to have data to be transmitted across a network with the enforceable proof of origin, so that we know that comes from the authority which has been requested to provide information, because that is the authoritative source for this data, and at the same time, proof of integrity, because the recipient will receive something that has no means to check against databases, because it comes from another country. So, e-seals. but also you need the conveyance, how to make sure that you know that the request has been served in, has been processed, and you have received electronic registered delivery services. Because at the end of the day, you have to have legal proof. So why? Because there might be, I would say, liabilities to which you may incur when you don't control the authentic source, but you have to trust what the authentic source is about in a way that is, of course, I would say, auditable and enforceable in law. Okay? So, is this only for public sector? Not at all. I mean, actually, we are working the first very domain in which we have made ourselves, I would say, quite visible vis-a-vis acknowledging the importance and the power of digital and the need to consider eIDAS regulation is actually anti-money laundering, because when we started, engaging with the private sector, the first three domains were banking, financial transaction, transport, like clearing and security in the airport, and electronic commerce. But it boiled down to the regulation. If the governing regulation doesn't give credit or doesn't acknowledge the possibility to use digital in a way that is secure and doesn't introduce risk of additional liabilities, there is no way to move forward. This is why, since we start our journey, we managed to get the Anti-Money Laundering Directive to fully recognize the, I would say, the legal environment provided by eIDAS. Why? Because it's a regulation, because it's for public sector, because indeed the same rules which are provided, or I would say, or the same, the objectives of the anti-money laundering in relation to proof of identity of the prospective clients are indeed, I would say, well served by the reliance on electronic identification credentials, which carries the proofs of in-person verification, like those a level high. And this is, of course, I would say, the trigger for things to become digital and portable. This is an example of the KYC. Of course, it was the first element that we did, but this is indeed what we are operationalizing now. We will have on Friday the third meeting of the expert group that we have set up with DG FISMA and DG Just on electronic identification and KYC to work towards making KYC, know your customer, to be portable. If I have a bank account in Italy or in Belgium and I want to open a bank account in Sweden, I may use, if I'm holding a notified electronic identification means of level high, I can use that as a proof to discharge the responsibility of, or to allow the prospective bank to discharge the responsibility of identifying me in person, and I can ask my current bank to move on my behalf the KYC credentials, or KYC attributes which are needed in order for the new bank to actually make themselves, make the bank to be fulfilling the regulation, the obligation that they have to meet in order to get me a new bank account. I think that is important because with digital you can do it. Now you can't even do it with, I would say, with paper. Even, from one bank to another down the road, you can do it. If you move from one corporate to another, you can do it. And of course, as I see the colleague from GSMA here, I think that, this is even more the way we have to go with mobile. And this is why I'm so glad that GSMA, for instance, they did a pilot with us to show how Mobile Connect, the authentication infrastructure that they have, which is being rolled out well beyond Europe, is actually fully compatible with the other, can be enriched to give the authentication means that they transact on Mobile Connect the legal proof of being linked to a person that has been identified, or digital, just by relying on the credentials that are, I would say, associated to eIDAS. The second part is on trust services. I think on trust services, I will only, I would say, make you to understand that this is about market. There are obligations for public sector to recognize, but this is about market. And it's about risk management. I think that what is important is indeed is about risk management. It is up to me to decide which type of service I may use, which type of car I may buy, which type of transport service I may rely upon. Risk management. But there are specific legal effects which indeed are important when you do certain type of transaction. For instance, an electronic mandate between banks. Electronic mandates means that digitally you have to make sure that you do acknowledge, or you are shielded vis-a-vis, I would say, enforcing a request to transfer money from one place to another based on something that is the consent. How do you can get the consent? Is a signature. How do you know that the signature is indeed not going to be challenged in court if the transfer comes from Italy to Sweden or the other way around? You use a qualified electronic signature, because a qualified electronic signature is qualified everywhere, is equivalent to a handwritten signature everywhere, cannot be challenged but for aspect of negligence. But this has nothing to do with the signature in itself. It's got to do with the, I would say, due care that indeed the owner of the technology that allows the creation of a qualified signature should indeed put in using those services. And last but not least, everything is technologically neutral. So you're doing it using X400 certificate, you're doing using, I would say, proofs on the distributed ledger, you're doing this using whatever, doesn't matter. What counts is what is indeed that we are defining as the service and the result, the outcome of the service. An electronic signature is whatever, can be produced via, I would say, a certificate or nothing. You know, just my name at the bottom of an email is a signature. What is the probatory value of it? That is the question. This is why you have specific legal effect. So the higher is the level of assurance and security and trustworthiness of what is generated, the more I would say the lower is the legal risk for those evidence to be recognized cross-border. Where we stand, we have 258 trust service provider, of which we have active 165 qualified, which means the service provisioning is there. Of course, I mean, it doesn't mean that in all countries we have everything, but what is qualified in country A is qualified in all the other 27 countries, as far as I would say the regulation is confirmed. So it cannot be as it being under the electronic signature directive, that when you create electronic signature in a country, then another countries may reject it. You know, think of electronic procurement. That was one of the main problems that we had, I would say, in the past before eIDAS. Is this happening only on anti-money laundering? No, it's happening in a number of places, because that is where indeed the direction is. We are indeed moving into making the sector-specific legislation, which are legacy in a sense because they were there before eIDAS, to fully take into account what is the digital. And taking the digital is not just for the similar, I would say, legal effect for something that is digital vis-a-vis the white version of it, but because by taking digital into the picture, you can get processes organized in a different way. Think of, for instance, the one solid principle and the single digital gateway. That is something that is only happening in a very convenient, secure, trustworthy, auditable, transparent way because the digital kicks in. But to get the digital kicks in, you have to have the legal framework right. You have to make the legal framework to work across border, which is what indeed we are doing in eIDAS. And of course, I mean, you can have also interesting use, like the one of this distinguishing what is a trustworthy source of information or an author, because you may associate, for instance, and this is the action that on which we are working now, a stamp, a token to a poster, which doesn't disclose who is the author, but it gives you the proof that whoever is the author of that, because the token is associated in a way that is unique to the content that cannot be changed, or if changed, you can verify that it's changed, that person is taking all the responsibility and is identified. Which means that if defamatory content is there, you can appeal, you can, I would say, trigger a legal procedure, and whoever is indeed in charge of pursuing that actions would be able to identify the person. So not you, not the host of the blog, but whoever is indeed, I would say, in charge of such procedure. And of course, I mean, as you see, we are operationalizing it also in other of a domain. Proof of age means that you have to give a yes to a question. What is indeed are you more than X? Yes. Enforceable yes. Why should I comply with a true identity policy that asks me to provide the GSM number to a service provider? There is, for security reason? No, sorry, this is not security reason. If they want to have the proof and the true identity policy is to make sure that whoever is acting on that profile is a person that is verified and is always the same, that is I would say, acting on that profile, provided that is not giving the credential away, but that is negligence, and that is covered by existing legal framework, then they need to have a token associated to my profile. It can be Mickey Mouse on Facebook and be authoritative in speaking about what I do in my professional career without disclosing my name, perhaps my picture, but not my name. And even more importantly, not my GSM number, because there is no security requirements that is linked to have the GSM number. You may do like that, yes, but as we are in Europe, we may have also other way of doing it, like leveraging what we have already in our hands to prove that indeed we are existing. They want to know my name, my family composition, the name of my mother, the name of my brother, fine. I mean, I may be prepared to give all this, but there should be a different purpose. And I think that is our big challenge, in talking to, I would say, those who are in the process of allowing us to operationalize this framework. The gatekeepers, the service providers, the online platforms, the browsers. But of course, I mean, sometimes you have the stakeholders that are actually pushing, like in the PSD2, Regulatory Technological Standard. It was the banks that, in order to discharge their responsibility toward their clients and the regulatory authority, to ensure that they can check that a third-party payment service provider is indeed licensed, in order for them to be able to comply with a request that is triggered by their customer to get money transferred via that provider, is because of this requirement that the banks pushed EBA, European Banking Authority, to introduce the use of qualified website authentication certificate in the regulatory technical standard for the implementation of the strong customer authentication and the handshaking between systems under Article 98, I think, of the PSD2. Why? Because via website qualified authentication certificate, you have a process in place by which the service provider of the certificate has the duty to check whether the organization that is requiring the certificate is licensed. What is the license number? Should check that the license is still on, and guarantee that this process is conducted, and the process is audited before it is, I would say, rolled out as a service. And that, of course, gives a kind of, I would say, liability shield to the banks that may indeed rely on this. Okay, this is what I wanted to say in terms of the framework. So, eIDAS is not, I would say, the panacea, but is actually allowing our own credentials to speak for us, but not about us. I want to do something, they don't need to have my life. They need to have the credentials which are enforceable for the purpose of doing things. And this is important because it is, to some extent, the bridge between what may happen in terms of legal identity and what may be supported by other tools that could be like, the one that we are going to discuss today, blockchain. Sorry, I went a bit too far, I suppose.
Thank you, Andrea. So, after setting the context, my role here is try to explain how this is being put into practice. First, we will focus on what are the EID part, the mutual recognition of electronic identification. In this diagram, you have an example of a case in which a Portuguese citizen wants to access a cross-border service, online service provided by an authority in France, right? So this falls under the scope of the eIDAS regulation in the electronic identification part, in the mutual recognition. According to the eIDAS regulation, the Portuguese citizen, in the case that Portugal has notified the national EID, has the right to use the national identification means to access the service. How this is done in practice? Well, this is done through the nodes that are defined in the eIDAS interoperability framework. So each member state has a node. In this case, this is the French node, the Portuguese node, and all the communication goes through the nodes. These nodes create the trust framework that is behind the mutual recognition, because in the end, France is relying on an authentication that is made by Portugal. And for being able to do so, France needs to be sure that the information that comes is really backed up by the Portuguese government. So these two nodes are the ones that are really creating the trust. So the Portuguese citizen accesses the service provider asks the citizen to authenticate, and then once the service knows that it's a Portuguese citizen, sends the request to the French node sends the request to the Portuguese node, and Portugal performs the authentication. The authentication according to the national ID means. This authentication can be enhanced with some attributes, which Andrea mentioned before, depending on the use cases on the specific domains, and all the information goes back through the eIDAS node to the service provider. So that's the way this works in practice. As you may see, there is a technical infrastructure composed by nodes. There are also specifications that govern the interface between the nodes, but somehow this is technologically neutral. The concept is the mutual recognition, because we have some entities, the eIDAS node, that are supported for the government by the member states, and the member states are taking responsibility on the authentication. This is a new example of the same concept. What is important to highlight here is that, as I mentioned before, the eIDAS only regulates what is the cross-border part, that is the information that is exchanged between the sending country, the one that is authenticating, and the receiving country, the one in which the service provider is located. So, and for that, the technical specification says that the SAML protocol needs to be used, but of course, these specifications can be changed as long as there is a need of adaptation to the new technology, and also defines a minimum data set for this exchange. What is this minimum data set? The purpose of the regulation in the eID part is to provide data that can uniquely represent a person. So the purpose is not to, let's say, authenticate people anonymously, but authenticate people that can be uniquely identified. Because we have to remember that we are talking about the access to public services, and for accessing to public services, we need people to be exactly identified. We need to distinguish one citizen from another. That's why in the eIDAS regulation, there is this requirement about the minimum data set. The minimum data set then is defined for natural persons and for legal persons, because the eIDAS regulation covers also authentication of legal persons, and it defines a set of mandatory elements that are the current family name, current first name, the date of birth, and a unique identifier that needs to be in every authentication between the nodes, right? And then it defines a set of optional attributes, optional data that can be added to this mandatory data in order to identify the person. Why we need these optional attributes? Because in some cases, these mandatory pieces of data are not enough to identify uniquely a person. In some countries, the unique identifier is persistent throughout all the life of the citizen. For example, your national ID number, in some countries, you get one when you are born and you keep it all your life. But in other countries, there are not such a concept, and the identifier changes. So in those countries, to identify uniquely a person, you may need, for example, the place of birth or the first name or family names of birth. So depending on the situation of the member states, there is a combination of mandatory and optional data, always with the same purpose of identifying uniquely a single citizen. And of course, we have what we call the sector-specific attributes that are not defined as such in the regulation, but are defined as in the technical specifications in order to allow to add attributes linked to identity to support different use cases. And the same concept exists for the legal person, who have some mandatory attributes, that are the current legal name and the unique identifier, and then these optional attributes that may be needed according to the national practice to identify the legal person. So in the eIDAS identification part, these are the attributes related to identity that are managed. And as I say, the purpose is uniquely identify a person. So no anonymity in the eID part. Regarding to the trust services, Andrea mentioned before all the novelties that introduce the eIDAS regulation with the trust services, but in terms of e-signatures and e-seals, that are the two trust services that we think that are very relevant for the use of blockchain for identity, the eIDAS regulation just keeps the same framework that existed in the signature directive. It defines three different types of signatures. The simple signature with a basic requirements about this kind of signature. This can be almost everything. that you may want to use to prove that you accept some sort of content. Then we have the advanced signature. There are additional requirements related to the link of what is signed to your identity. There are requirements related to the capacity of control the signature means, and there is also requirements about the integrity of the document, and then we have the higher level of security that are the qualified signatures, that are advanced signatures that are relying on a qualified electronic certificate and are also using a qualified signature creation device. This means that you may have any kind of signature in your business processes, but according to the needs, you may like to use advanced, qualified, or simple, and also taking into account that the legal value of the different signature is different. In the simple signature, of course, the regulation says that a signature cannot be rejected just because it's electronic, but the legal value of a simple signature is not the same as a qualified. A qualified signature is accepted to be equivalent to the handwritten signature, and if you want to reject a qualified signature, you have to prove that there was something wrong in the signature. With the simple, you need additional supported evidence. The possibilities of challenging a simple signature are higher for the one that is using. That's why, in some cases where you need a higher level of trust, you would like to go for qualified signature. In practice, how this is implemented? Well, if we are using simple electronic signature, we may use any kind of signature device. In the case of advanced signatures, we are relying on digital certificates, and we may rely on digital certificates, but we also may rely on qualified digital certificates. The difference, in practical terms, could be related to the requirements for the issuance of the certificates, for the trust of the identity, and then if we go for qualified signature, then we will be using the qualified signature creation device. For that, for getting the status of qualified, the regulation sets different requirements and involves the supervisory bodies that are the ones that are really verifying that these requirements are met. And those trust services that are qualified, they are published in the trust list. So the trust system is based because all qualified service providers are public, are known, and you can verify if the certificate proving your identity issued by a trust service provider is qualified or not. And what is important to know also is that as Andrea mentioned before, is technology neutral. You can use local signing, mobile signing, remote signing. All these possibilities are acceptable, and it's not technology itself. What is important is here. It's the requirements related to the signature, not the technological need for that. Also, it's important to know that when issuing electronic certificates, the regulation sets some specific requirements about the identity data that are in the certificates. In the case of electronic signatures are for natural persons. The only requirement is that the name of the signatory or a pseudonym has to be in the certificate. This means that you can sign anonymous with a pseudonym. But there is a link between your true identity and your pseudonym that is kept by the trust service provider. In the case of electronic natural legal persons, then we are not using electronic signature but electronic seals because the regulation differentiates between the two concepts. The natural person signs and the legal person seal. But technically it's the same. We are using electronic certificates for signing in practice. And in the case of a natural legal person, the electronic seal must contain the name on the registration number because the identity of the legal person cannot be anonymous, it has to be public. But it's also important to know that electronic certificates can add additional attributes. So this is the minimum, but nothing prevents a trust service provider to add other additional data to the electronic certificate. And for example, they could add any kind of identifiers to the certificate to prove that the real identity of the person is linked to these identifiers, these additional attributes. So how can this be used in a blockchain? Well, if blockchain basically, as you know, is a set of data with the hash of the data and the hash of the previous block. What is important here is that data, we can put here any kind of data. This data, according to the eIDAS regulation, is an electronic document. because the definition of an electronic document is any content stored in electronic form. So you may know that, but as long as you put electronic, some content in electronic document, you are eIDAS compliant, or I would say you are under eIDAS. So an electronic document, it's always related to eIDAS. And also, what is important, Andrea mentioned that before, the legal effect. So an electronic document cannot be denied legal effect. So if there is a legal effect in any kind of electronic document you use, if it's used in a blockchain or whatever kind of technology, that's already there. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to be eIDAS compliant. You are already under eIDAS because you are using electronic documents. This could be a simplified scheme of the use of the blockchain. You know that the user decides to store some data in the blockchain, and then we have the signature of the content. So if you are signing, again, you are under eIDAS. You may like to sign with a simple signature, you may like to sign with an advanced or a qualified, but as long as you are signing something, you are fulfilling what is defined in the eIDAS as an electronic signature. Then the data is sent to the network, there is the consensus process, the validation, and then you time stamp and put it there in the blockchain. Then if you are time stamping, then you are also using one of the services that is defined under the eIDAS regulation. So as you see, these operations that are in the blockchain are operations that are already there foreseen in that regulation. Of course, the thing is how you perform this operation. If you are using qualified, advanced, you are relying on trust services or you are relying on other kinds of technology. But in principle, eIDAS regulation is already foreseeing that. This could be an example of, or also a simplified scheme of the use of blockchain for identity. Basically, all the proposals that are
5 minutes left. 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you. So in all the proposal for implementation of the blockchain for identity, the thing is that we have the user. The user wants to keep the control about the information, and then usually the user needs to present some identity information to a receiver. The receiver for accessing some service. This information could be self-asserted data that is generated by the user himself or herself, or the user can present third-party attestation. For example, he wants to present a diploma or a certificate stating that he has a degree in engineering, right? And of course, in the case that we are using third-party attestation, we need an issuer that gives the trust to the document that we are presenting. So the thing here is always, this is technically, this can be done very easily, but the thing here is about the trust, because the receiver needs to know that the information that is receiving is really being issued by the appropriate issuer, by the authoritative source. So if it is a certificate about a degree, the receiver wants to know that the issuer has been there in university. And of course, if you are presenting a self-asserted data and the user has to be accountable about this self-asserted data, the receivers want to have also the chance to identify the user to make him or her accountable. So there is a need of linking, in some specific use cases, linking the identity that you have in the blockchain to your real identity. And that's precisely the role of the eIDAS trust service providers. Of course, you can think of any imaginative way of linking the identity in the blockchains with the real identity. But you don't need to do that because this is already there with the eIDAS regulation, because the role of the trust service providers is precisely that, is to link the real identity to the digital identity by means of the electronic certificates. So if you are using somehow in your business case an electronic signature with a certificate issued by a trust service provider, you can make the user accountable for what is signed because you have the identity link and asserted. If you are using electronic seals, you can know that the issuer is really the authority that is meant to be there. And also you can use the seals for the receiver because the user needs to control to whom is disclaiming information, and the user needs to be sure that he wants to send information to a bank, he's really sending information to the bank. So the receiver also may need to be identified. The trust service providers are doing exactly that in the eIDAS regulation. In the case of eID, we see two different use cases. One would be making use of the authentication provided by the eIDAS regulation to create the identity in the user agent of the wallet. So in this example, when the user, Portuguese citizen, for example, wants to create the wallet, then uses an authentication under eIDAS to link his identity to the identity that is created for the blockchain. In that case, the identity can be used also for a backup identity as a sort of master or root identity that you could reuse anytime in case you need to generate a new identity. And this root identity could be asserted by the Portuguese government in this system. So that could be a way of using eIDAS. But what is also important is that eIDAS make use of the blockchain for identity because the blockchain for identity could be a source of attributes. So in this example, the citizen wants to use a service provider. The service provider needs the minimum data set that I explained before, but needs additional attributes, and these attributes could be managed in a digital identity blockchain. Then the identity provider and the attribute provider could need to be linked, but this could be made easily if we perform the previous step, that is linking the identity in the wallet provided by the eIDAS with the identity that is already in the blockchain. So as you may see, there are many ways of using what is provided by the regulation in the concept of identity for the blockchain. So that's all from my part. These are some information data, these are my contact data, and I will be here all the day for you to answer questions. So that's all.
Thanks a lot. So I have two questions, one for each of you, and then we can spend a couple of minutes with the questions from the audience. So first question is, so I was looking at the tax website in France right now. The only ways to log in are French identity systems.
Yes.
But so is acceptance of other countries' eIDs mandatory right now, and why isn't it on the website?
This is a question you have to ask to the French, I suppose. And I'll tell you why. Because, there are two aspects. The recognition, so if you go to the German authority, or the Luxembourg authorities, or the Dutch authority, they recognize the German, that is the only one today that it should be recognized. The other one that were in the list would be to be recognized in about a year time, because that is the regulation. Even though member states may decide on voluntary basis to do it from the day that the notification is published on the official journal. Now, for the recognition, there is a caveat because of the sovereign responsibility. As I said, the baseline is, I would say, for recognition, the electronic identification means which are used at the national level should be at least at the level substantial or high, so two-factor authentication, and the public administration, so the member states, retain the responsibility to decide what is needed at the national level for the authentication. Now, we don't know whether Mobile Connect is level substantial or high. It is not clear, and of course that may be the reason why France is not operating in a way that they may recognize the German. The reality is, I suppose, that they haven't completed the connection, the technical connection, because, of course, that is an obligation under the others. But the prior condition for us to be able, as enforcer, to say, okay, France, in this case, is in breach of the regulation, is to have a clear statement that the level required at the national level is at least level substantial. And that we don't have, because member states are not required to. Of course, it will be more and more the case for countries like Austria, but also, I would say, unfortunately, also my country, that indeed there will be, I would say, a request to justify why this is not happening. And this is indeed what we are doing as we speak in my unit.
Thanks. And then the second question, so I think I understood the whole presentation, except the end. I didn't understand at all what was the role of blockchain. I understand if you're an application that runs on the blockchain, you might need your users to authentify themselves, and then we are exactly in the same framework as the one that was described before. But apart from that, I don't understand why the blockchain plays a role here. Can you maybe summarize it in a few sentences for us to better understand?
Yes, I mean, the eIDAS regulation doesn't create any obligation for anyone except for member states to recognize notified IDs. So you can implement whatever you want related to identity, but if you rely on the eIDAS, then you get the certainty that is provided by eIDAS. So what I was trying to present is some ways in which the eIDAS regulation can help to create a trust for all the operations in a blockchain for identity that need to rely on this trust. Maybe I didn't succeed on that, but so if blockchain is using identity, then the eIDAS regulation provides a framework for creating trust in that identity. That's all.
I think that this is important, in particular in the perspective of what I think is the European project, to go and to move in the direction of a European blockchain infrastructure for the provision of services of public interest, where the identity and the legal identity may play a role. Of course, this is not the only case, but as I said before, for instance, another case, in regulated environments, would it be transport, would it be bank, financial sector, payments, the link to the true identity, to the real identity, verified in a way that is, I would say, enforceable in court, becomes an element. And I think that the idea here is to show how indeed the framework is compatible and can enrich and support, but it depends really on what is the business case and what is indeed I would say, the intention of whatever type of solution is being developed under the blockchain.
Thank you. May I add something? Yes.
I would just give the microphone.
There was one good question is that I think that in the identity there are two parts. One is the control of the user identity, but there is also one party that is receiving the identity, and it's very important that this identity is recognized. That is what, from our point of view, eIDAS has a role, because it can provide the trust in order to that identity to be recognized. Because it's not useful to have an identity if you cannot use it, because no one is trusting that identity. That is what eIDAS provides.
So I guess my question follows on to that, because the benefit of a distributed ledger, as I think many of us understand it, is really about not having to have this hierarchical root, or not having to have this centrally agreed upon true identity that backs everything, and still have a trustworthy mechanism for making transactions. So my question specifically is, do we need these so-called true identities to be unitary in order to use the system? Which is to say, would it be possible to allow people to cultivate and develop multiple true identities for the purpose of this, or is there some intrinsic reason why people are expected to have only one?
I think that we try to convey the message that indeed we are not preaching for the legal identity to be associated to any transaction. On the contrary, we are just bringing forward the fact that when this is needed, in a way that is explicit, because you need to know that you talk to Andrea Servida, in the ledger, or you need to talk to somebody who may be linked to a true identity, which is not relevant to the transaction, or to you as a recipient of whatever, but may be relevant in terms of auditability, enforcement, and anything else that would be, I would say, needed in the real world. Then you know that you may trigger a link between what speaks for me, my name, my identifier, my pseudonym, and the person. So it's not that we say we should be, no, but when this is the case that you need that type of link, then of course, you may consider having this type of interaction. That's the first second. The second one is in relation to the legal, I think I read a few weeks ago that there was this news about, the first time in the world that the court accepted a blockchain, I would say, in court. Actually, in Europe, you can do it already now because of what is there. So it means, what is there to support what you're doing in the way in which you want to do.
So really the question is, can you have more than one?
Of course.
Yes. And can they be completely unlinkable?
It depends on what you want to play. For instance, for public provisioning, I'm Italian, I've resided in the Netherlands, in Italy, in the UK and Belgium. I'm different identities there. And of course, when I get to a public service in Belgium, whether I'm using my Italian certificate or my Dutch certificate, they need to know that it's always the same Andrea Servida. So the issue is at the recipient end, what is indeed the data minimization risk that they have to tackle. There might be transactions where I use indeed independently one or the other because it is not the business of the recipient to unify what is happening at that side. You know, if I buy a cigarette, they don't need to know that I'm is address Servida every time. They just need to know that the transaction is, I would say, completed, full stop. So it depends really on what is the business case that you are looking at. And there is where, in particular for the provision of service of public interest, there might be a need to reconcile the diversity. This is why this discussion on the data minimization and the use of identifier for cross-border transactions that are as persistent as possible kicked in exactly because public administration will have to reconcile. You know, I have two citizenship, two passport. I may use both of them to authenticate. But the service provider in the country, public service in that case, should reconcile, I would say, to the same person.
So we're going to take two more questions and then we move on. But I think if I just summarize what you just said, I think what you're saying is you're not saying that necessarily I need to be tracked with my true identity in everything I do. You're saying you provide a platform that services that need a true identity can rely on.
In a way that is privacy protected. Because I can be tracked to myself without disclosing to any party that is myself. Because I can use the pseudonym, I can use the identifier and the ledger, but I'm accountable to what I'm doing and I'm traceable to what I'm doing, but via due process that will trigger that link. So that, you know, if I open a bank account, whether you like it or not, you have to be identified under the anti-money laundering directive. But I can have the entitlement, my KYC, on a blockchain, which is not speaking about me at all. But is linked to an identifier, which is linked to an entity that is enforceable, and the KYC, when it's received, can be triggered via that. Okay.
Yeah, actually, my question is linked directly to that, because I work for a civil society organization. I think privacy is very important. And in this sense, I think we should challenge the notion that identity is necessary to subscribe to any form of service. The only thing that's necessary is when something goes wrong, you need identity. So, you know, that's we're coming back to the blockchain and why that may be useful. The multiple key signatures, for instance, concept where one key signature gives you certain governance rights or certain access rights, and distributing those key signatures amongst different actors is very interesting. So, for instance, to de-anonymize someone when you go open a bank account, you need a key from the judicial department, for instance, or from the court order. Until you do that, you know, the database or the bank can only prompt your information with certain questions. Are you above 18? Are you a resident of the country? If yes, you can open a bank account. They don't need to know your name, your address, nothing.
It depends on the legal framework. And the anti-money laundering doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
for
sure.
betting, yes, it does that way. For betting, that's that way. The only compulsory requirements for e-gambling providers are verify the residency and the age. So, you know, if I'm accessing service in Belgium, gambling service in Belgium, the provider should verify that I'm actually residing in Belgium and I'm more than 18 until payments are done or whatever. So it depends on the legal framework. It depends. But certainly what you're saying is absolutely true. This is why I said, you know, we should turn the identity to speak for us, but not about us. That is the motto that we are pushing. Because at the end of the day, you need just the enforceable link, not to the disclosure of all the attributes that makes you an identity in the physical world.
Hi, I have a question. So I understand that there is actually an opportunity for blockchain and eID and eIDAS to work together, and it also depends on the business model. And here I have my question, and it's actually I understand it's free for public administration to use the nodes between themselves, and they have to recognize each other. But when it comes to the public or the private sector and like the private initiatives like blockchain, let's say, how does that work? It's the member state decide if they want to open their nodes to the private sector, and then do they make it free or not? And then it depends from one country to another. So what is the, you know, how do you see the business model and the commercial discussion here?
I think that has got to do with even more than that. It's got to do with who pays at the national level for the authentication. In Sweden, for instance, it's the government that pays the banks for you to be able to use your bank card to authenticate. In my country, I do pay the means and I'm paying the service provider if I use the private one to get the means. Sometimes I don't even pay. Why? Because if I buy the means, I get perhaps offer a bank account which can be opened in the same organization. It depends on the business model. What is important in the others, and this we cannot change in relation because it's sovereign responsibility. However, there should not be discriminatory treatment of parties. So you can't have a kind of regime in your country, and then when this applies to private sector in another country, then it's a different one. That is the bare minimum. What I think the member states have still to move, but certainly the demands will make this for them to move, or will make them to move, is indeed where is indeed that we need to make this to happen first. And I think that, opening to the private sector, as I said, is one of the recitals. I think it's recital 16, if I'm not mistaken, of the regulation. But it's the member states to decide. Why? Because the investment that was made was made by the public sector in certain countries. Other countries is a joint endeavor, as it is in the UK or in Italy, for instance.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you very much, Carlos, for this presentation. Thank you for your questions. I apologize. I saw at least two people there who had also questions. We will come back to this topic in the afternoon, so no worries. We will still have time to discuss this and ask questions on this topic. Thank you very much. Thank you again, and I will ask the panelists to come up front for the panel discussion. Thank you very much.